Okay, going to get this set up now. Okay. Good morning, everyone. We have an opportunity to study God's Word. We're in the book of Isaiah. We're going through chapters 13 through 23. It'll probably take us 2 weeks to go through all these chapters. They're connected. They're judgments against different nations, the surrounding nations. So we want to take a look at the map again and see the general relationship of the different countries that are going to be talked about, and we're going to be looking at just an overview of the history this week and an overview of the nations and what's being said, and then next week we'll go through some of the specifics of each of the chapters. We're going to go through again the whole 11 chapters in basically 2 weeks. So this section is not as critical to a lot of Isaiah is pointing to the Messiah, so we want to focus on that material. And these things are important, but they're more for that time and that period to reinforce the fact that Isaiah was a prophet of God and that God is in control of even the nations. As it talks about later in Isaiah, that the nations are nothing compared to God. And it's to give confidence that even, no matter what they're going through, God is with them and God is in control. All right, so let's start with a prayer, and then we'll get into our intro to the chapters. Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity you give us this morning to come together. We thank you that we have the comforts and the security in this country to come together and to worship you without much persecution. We know that that could change at any time. Father, we know that our purpose here is to serve you no matter what happens, to show honor to you and to glorify you by obeying you and humbling ourselves before you and showing others, and that we are faithful to you and that we point them to you as well. Help us as we go through your words today to learn more about you and to have more confidence in you and your words, and that we would be more determined to serve you faithfully. And we thank you for the opportunity we'll have later to come together and worship you. Help us to do so in a manner that is pleasing in your sight and also in a way that is encouraging to one another. It's in your Son's name we pray and give you thanks. Amen. So, the first map, I just want to point out, this should be a review, but again, it might take time if you haven't been spending much time looking at the maps and the geography of the region. I think it's good to learn. And especially from ancient history, this is a map that's about the time of, we'll say, 700 or 800 BC. So it's in the same period of time. And right now you have the Assyrian Empire, and that's sort of its homeland. And by the way, all these nations and empires, there's kind of a fluidity. It's not like this was a nation and things changed over centuries, like they do today. There's, in our world, that things are more stable. At least what we say, for like 100 years. But even then, you look at a map 50 years ago and changes in countries and boundaries, it's very common. Back then, maybe there was even more of that. But you have the Empire of Assyria. There's these two rivers. Everybody should know these two rivers. What are they? Euphrates and the Tigris. And the land between the two rivers is the Mesopotamia. Meso is between, Potamia is rivers. So when you say the Potomac River, that's a redundancy. But the region between the rivers was very, it's the cradle of civilization, very built up, and some of the great empires came from this region. Babylonia is in the southern part of this region, and then the Chaldeans were actually a little bit different group, but they kind of morphed with the Babylonians, and so they became known as, the Chaldeans of Babylon, the Babylonians, the Chaldeans. The names kind of ran together. Then over here, You have Aram, with Damascus its capital. We talked about that. Along the coast, you have Phoenicia, and the big city is Tyre and Sidon. There's obviously Byblos, where we get the term Bible. You have very close to the bottom the Philistines. Down here is Egypt. And there's different parts of Egypt and different sections, and that's very fluid as well. And then you have below the area of the Jews, this would be the area of the Jews right here. But below them is Edom, and then Moab and Ammon. Those are the three nations. Those are all relatives of the Jews, if you remember that. Okay? Does anyone remember Moab and Ammon? Whose relatives were they, or descendants were they? Lot. And then we have Edom, whose descendants are they? Esau. And even then there's other people that were involved, but basically the descendants of Esau. All right, so this is the first map. And I also want to point out the bodies of water that surround this whole region. You have the Mediterranean Sea. You have two sections of the Red Sea, and then the Red Sea goes down further. Over here you have the Persian Gulf. Up here the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. So you kind of see that this whole region of ancient history that's involving the Bible is surrounded by those seas. So it's good to kind of have a picture of this in your mind. All right. The next slide is the timeline. And I just want to remind everybody, again, the general period we're talking about here. Isaiah prophesied, we'll say 750 down to about 690. And there's a little bit of question about how far back into Uzziah's reign he prophesied. And did he prophesy into Manasseh's reign? There's a verse that might indicate that it talked about that. But basically, Isaiah covers about 50 years, we'll say, of time that he made prophecies. And part of the, I wouldn't say problem, but let's say difficulty in looking at these judgments against nations in chapters 13 to 23 is when exactly did Isaiah write this particular prophecy or that prophecy? So that's a big question. When was it written during the time? The second thing is I believe that Isaiah probably wrote these prophecies against the nations all throughout his career as a prophet, I guess you could say. And then they lumped them together in the book of Isaiah as judgments against nations. I think that makes the most sense. It's hard to know for sure, but that seems to be what happened. So some of the prophecies were made earlier, some of them later, and that affects which judgment might have been, which campaign of a foreign power came and humbled them, or obviously if it was a destruction, you kind of know when that destruction was. But if it's just a humbling of a nation by an oppression, then there's several different opportunities or choices to make. All right, so anyway, in the timeline, a couple of things we want to remember. In Judah, you have Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. That's the period, okay? And we're going to be spending a lot of time looking at the time of Hezekiah later. That's when a lot of the prophecies were made. And then we have here Assyria, and you have Pul, and by the way, that's a name that we see in history, and we see Tiglath-Pileser. The Bible mentions both of the different forms of his name that we see in secular history. Shalmaneser, I think it's like the 5th, Sargon the 2nd, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and then Ashurbanipal. And I have no idea how to pronounce those names, that's how I pronounce them. But you have these different emperors or kings of the Assyrian Empire, and all of them are mentioned in the Bible. And so it's important that we kind of get at least a little bit familiar with, okay, there's an Assyrian Empire. If you don't remember the name, that's fine. But there's an Assyrian Empire, and there was this lineage of kings of Assyria that are mentioned in the Bible, and we see all sorts of records of theirs in history too. And I pointed that out before. There's a whole website of all the different kings of Assyria and all the different inscriptions they found and records that they found and have been translated. I have a couple of examples of that again today just to show you and remind you that there's so much of the Bible that is provable history. It's not somebody just making up stories. It is actual history. And what's amazing is so many people have tried to say that the Bible is just a bunch of made-up history. And that's failed overwhelmingly. All right. The other thing I wanted to mention is Egypt at this time is we see So or Osaka in the fourth, and then Tahaka. And what we understand is from during this period, and we'll come back to it in a minute, but during this period, Egypt was ruled by a Kushite dynasty. And we'll get back to the Kush. The nation of Kush is sort of like Nubians. It's southern, it's south of Egypt. It's really what we would call Sudan today. It's not really Ethiopia. A lot of times people say Kush is Ethiopia. And again, these nations are kind of fluid. So sometimes Ethiopia was bigger or smaller. So some of these names it's kind of hard to nail them down. But basically, they're south of Egypt. These people have come into Egypt, and they are controlling Egypt for about 100 years. So we have this Egyptian dynasty, which is actually not Egyptian, or at least people that are similar but not really Egyptian. All right, let's see, anything else? Oh, and an important date for this time is the 722 BC when Israel falls to Assyria. The northern kingdom falls, Samaria is besieged, and then within 3 years, Hosea, the last king, he's the last king, the kingdom ends, and most people are either killed or sent into captivity. There's a small remnant in the land, but it's a very weak and insignificant remnant. I wanted to give you a second map for several reasons, just again to remind you and review it, because it does take time to go through. But I want you to notice over here the bigger map with all the bodies of water, and then we zoom into the local section. But before I do that, this is the section. You see the two little sections of the Red Sea, and then the Sinai Peninsula is cutting into those. Well, it's cutting into the Red Sea to make the two sections, and this part of Egypt. Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt, Cush, and also Ethiopia. So I have looped there. That's my way of remembering it. And again, some of these are connected, and you could even argue, well, that's the same, but depends on the period of time. And so Cushites are further south, and they took over Egypt for a long period of time. So all along, everybody that lived there lived along the Nile, because the Nile was what made it habitable. And so you have those four sections in the region of Egypt. And then again, just to remind you, here's the Assyrians coming in, and they come in and they, over many campaigns, they take or they subjugate, destroy different nations in the region. And you have Aram again, with capital of Damascus. You have Ammon, Moab, and Edom. Egypt over here, Judah and Israel, with the Philistines along the coast, and the Phoenicians along the coast here, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos. These were all very powerful cities. They were merchants. They were controlling the Mediterranean Sea. They were very much the power on the seas. And because of their being merchants and, what's the other word for it, where they're going from place to place and... Traders, that's good enough, traders. The traders were very wealthy, and so that wealth brought influence and power. They were described as kingmakers. They could go into a region, and because of their wealth, they could have an influence on who was going to be king in certain places. So they were a very powerful, and Isaiah says a very ancient city. Tyre especially. All right, so let's see. I think we've got everything we need there from that map. Okay, so now I have a chart of the chapters. And what we see, all these chapters, and really there's some in chapter 10 and 11 that's talking about God using Assyria to judge these nations, but also using Assyria especially to judge Israel and Judah. But then it also talks about a judgment against against Assyria. So there is that judgment against Assyria in the chapters previous. But now in this section, you have judgments against Babylon. And that's probably the most controversial chapter because of some arguments people make about what it affects besides just the period of Babylon. Because, like in Revelation, for instance, there's a discussion of Babylon, so that invites a lot of questions. But we have the judgment against Babylon, a very small one against Philistia, 2 chapters against Moab, and then we have against Damascus, which is Aram, the capital, against Cush, against Egypt, again against Cush and Egypt. It kind of combines it with a judgment. And then we have against the wilderness of the sea, which is Babylon, but it might also be the southern part of Babylon, which are the Chaldeans. But again, they're already morphing into one major group. And against Edom, sometimes some translations like King James will call it Duma, but that's Edom. Against Arabia, which is often called Kedar. And again, I don't know how to pronounce these, I just read them. Against Judah, and then against Tyre, mostly Tyre, but also it mentions Sidon, which is Phoenicia. So you have all these judgments, and if you notice, that's pretty much everything we just showed you on the map. Everything surrounding Israel and Judah, and including, now Israel's not on here. Why isn't Israel on this list? Why isn't Israel on this list? Judah is, but why not Israel? Because Assyria has already dealt with Israel. Assyria has already destroyed the northern city of the northern city of Samaria and effectively removed them. Now, whether these judgments are some of them before or afterwards really isn't important, because in Isaiah we see in the chapters before Assyria is dealing with the northern kingdom of Israel. So Israel doesn't have to be mentioned in this, but everybody else is mentioned in this list. Okay, and so that should help us. And by the way, this is an important point, which we'll see. There's hints of a future mercy, which is pointing to, I believe, the gospel. So even in the sections of Isaiah that's focusing on that period of time or shortly afterwards, there still ends up being little hints about what God's going to do in the future. Because everything God is doing from before the foundation of the world is planning for what? It's for Jesus, his spiritual kingdom through Jesus. So there's already all throughout Isaiah language about what's going on now to prove who God is, to give them confidence of God's power and control over the nations. And then also pointing to God's ultimate purpose, which is through Judah to bring the blessings to the world, which is, again, Jesus, ultimately. All right. So, yes, Ray.
So all this, what's going on here, is that like God purifying all the sins?
Yeah, I don't know all of God. God has usually many, many reasons when he does something. So it's not just one reason. But God is letting everybody know that when there's rebellion, when there's corruption, he's going to judge it. So he's helping Israel and Judah to know that, but it helps all of mankind that when God sees corruption, when he sees people hurting each other and taking advantage of each other, God is not pleased. And it's also proving that ultimately God is in control. And how does God exert control in many cases? How do we see that in these chapters? How is God exerting his control?
Allowing takeovers.
Excuse me?
Allowing the takeovers.
Allowing the takeovers or using nations to judge other nations. Okay? But then even every single time, and this is really important, I believe, Assyria is used by God to judge Israel and Judah. But then what happens after God uses this nation to judge them? What happens next? In just about every case. God says, now I'm going to judge you because you didn't do it for me. You were doing it for your own wicked reasons, but now I'm going to judge you. Then he raises up, so he uses Babylon to judge Assyria. But then he uses Babylon to bring judgment against Judah and the surrounding nations. But then God says, what am I going to do? I'm going to judge Babylon. That's an important topic, and I think it helps us to understand some of the things that are going on in the New Testament times, as far as I'm concerned. I believe it's very important to understand that God is going to use Rome to bring judgment against Israel, but God is also going to use Rome and allow it to persecute the early church, which is going to help to strengthen it and purify it. But then what will God do? God will judge Rome as well. And I believe that's a necessary part of the New Testament teaching. And I think that's where Revelation comes in. It's really a very important part that God is going to make sure we understand that he's going to use Rome to bring judgment, but then he's going to judge Rome. Somebody had a hand up? Yes.
So he judged these cities, but what's the possible coming out of it once they get judged? Is there something positive?
Well, anybody who has eyes to see will do what? What will people who have a concern for things and some respect or fear of God, what will they do when they see these judgments? They will humble themselves. They will obey. And so it's for that reason. But it's also recording the truth that God is in control of nations, even nations. Because the Jews would need to know that over the next 500 plus years, wouldn't they? Wouldn't they need to know that God was in control when they were oppressed terribly by these great empires? I mean, not just little, empires, big empires. And it seemed like what? No one could defeat that empire. This empire is too big. We have to submit to them. We have to compromise because they are so big. But who's in control? God. It's a lesson. Daniel teaches us that too. Yes?
Yeah, and to me, in Isaiah 26, he sums it up when he says, when your judgments are in the earth, the inhabitants of the world are righteous.
Great. Yeah, and that's not always true, but that will be true for some people. And that's what God is reaching out for, is for those who will listen. And because of that, some people will be humbled to begin listening too. It's not just some people that are already faithful, but it will humble some people. Will it humble everybody? Absolutely not. But it will humble some. And those that are willing to listen will learn some lessons from these things. All right, so those are the list of the chapters. Again, we might start that today, but I'm thinking probably next week. But that's the kind of list that we're going to go through, and we're going to do through basically in 1 week. That's the plan, yes.
Getting your point too, I think it sums up the finality of all men in that even though in our time we see unrighteousness, we see wickedness that doesn't seem to be dealt with, eventually, New Testament, the day of judgment is going to come and all rights will be exalted and all wrongs will be punished.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's telling the justice of God, the ultimate judgment of God, and each of these limited in time and space judgments are pointing to the character of God and the truth of that ultimate judgment. So that's another important topic. Yes?
Just build on Daryl's point. I think some people today, some people I know, people today, they reach the false conclusion because bad things have gone on at certain eras that somehow God was, winking at it, or he was completely okay with it. But it's just not the case. And I think we all need to have that perspective. But whether it was thousands of years ago or whether it was something I did in my 20s, like God doesn't find sin okay at any point.
No, absolutely not. Good point. And also that sometimes people say, well, God's not working today like he did before. Does God see the same things today? Is he still concerned about the same things today? Absolutely. And so none of this changes. But what has changed is, again, God's already made his powerful argument in the first century. And now all we need to do is listen and respect and obey and understand that judgment will come. We don't have to keep on seeing examples. Now again, is God still making judgments in this world? I'm sure of it. Are we going to necessarily always know? No, I don't believe we can for sure know unless what? Unless God tells us this was a judgment from God. We can say, I think that was a judgment from God. And it very well might be, but we can't really know unless like some prophet comes and says this was a judgment from God. All right, so next. When you go through these events of these chapters, you see that there's the period of the Assyrians, and there were several times when it could be, okay, maybe he's talking about this judgment at this particular time during Assyria, or this particular time, or this particular time of Assyria. So there's different kings of Assyria and different campaigns. And by the way, a lot of these nations got stomped on a regular basis. So it's kind of hard to know which stomping is the one mentioned here. And also, you have to understand that we don't have an exact understanding of each of these events. We have some records, and we have a lot of records, but it's still limited. So when we look at what the Bible says and we say, I think it was this particular campaign or this attack that was being described, I'm not sure we can completely understand that. But would they have understood in their time? Almost certainly they would have had a better understanding because it was all relevant to them and their present period. And they would know more about exactly when Isaiah said it and the details. Then some of the judgments are Babylonian. So Babylonians took over power at about 609 BC, approximately there. It kind of was a transition as they were defeating Assyria and becoming the major power. By the way, it's not as simple as Babylon defeated the Assyrians. It was, at that time, Assyria and Egypt had formed an alliance, and Babylon and a whole bunch of other nations had formed an alliance against Assyria. But as soon as the alliance defeated Assyria, Babylon then took over. It's sort of like the Medes and the Persians. Who was really the one that was the power that destroyed Babylon? Was it the Medes or the Persians? It was the Medes that was the powerful empire, but who ended up taking over? The Persians. They were kind of a subgroup, and they ended up taking over the kingdom. Basically, Cyrus, being a Persian man, took over the empire. So a lot of times there's all sorts of things going behind the scenes. There's all sorts of battles, all sorts of campaigns. It gets very confusing. But in the end, Babylonia effectively becomes the new empire after Assyria. And then the Medo-Persians effectively become the new empire after Babylon. And then you have, after Medo-Persia, you have the Greeks and then the Romans. And again, some of the details are pointing to the first century. So we have to say, well, when is he describing? What attack, what humbling occurred at what period of time? All right, let's see. Anything else there? And another concern, and we'll look at this afterwards, but some of these chapters, when you look at it, you say, it doesn't sound like it was really, it might have been this judgment here, but that didn't really answer all the details of the chapter. So is it this judgment, or is it several judgments together over a long period of time that was the judgment against that nation? So is it one attack, or is it many over hundreds of years that finally brought them to an end, or to basically obscurity? And so some of that's part of the difficulties in looking at this. Also, let's see, anything else? That's good enough. So next, I just wanted to, not that it's that important, but you have Egypt and you have all these cities, and notice everywhere in Egypt it's all along the Nile or through the Delta. So this is Lower Egypt. We don't think of it that way because we think of, higher is upper and down, but this is again, the Nile flows from all the mountains here all the way down to the Mediterranean Sea. So Upper Egypt here is in the mountains, basically, in the south. So there's also a Middle Egypt, but you have two main cities that are talked about, Memphis and Thebes. And because the Cushites live down here, the Cushites came and took over Egypt and ruled Egypt for about 100 years. All right? And so I have, again, Lower, Upper, Cush, and then Ethiopia is more over here, but it's still southern. And again, some of these are kind of interchangeable because they controlled whole areas, or they controlled each other for a while. I've got a couple of diagrams just to show you some details. I wanted to mention, too, we're going to find out later that, for instance, the destruction of Memphis and Thebes and Memphis are kind of important major cities, and we're going to look at them a little bit later. So I'll come back to them. That's why I put that up there. This is it's the victory stele of Esarhaddon, and it was in 671 where he came and he attacked Egypt. And they believe that this was at least partially when the chapters that talk about the attack against Egypt and Cush. Again, at this time, Egypt is Cush, basically, because Cush took over Egypt for 100 years, so it's Cushite. It's a Cushite dynasty. So anyway, they have this inscription, and this is Esarhaddon, and he's got this rope around this child's neck. That's the son of Tirhakah. Tirhakah was the king, this Nubian or this Cushite king who was ruling over Egypt. Well, Tirhakah managed to escape, but his family was taken, and so they bring back his son, and they've got his son on a leash, basically, to show we're in control over Egypt. And from now on, after him, Assyria is exerting control over Egypt. They don't have perfect control, but they've chosen the next pharaoh or king of Egypt, and they're saying, you will submit to us. And of course, what are the kings going to do? Are they going to fully submit to Assyria, or they're going to find ways to maybe rebel against them? So it's not going to be perfect, but Tirhakah escapes, and again, now his dynasty is basically ended, but he's still around and he's still causing problems for a while. So it's not as simple as, okay, Assyria took over Egypt and now Egypt is a part of Assyria or aligned with Syria. It's not as simple as that. There's all sorts of scheming going on by everybody, which is basically always true. But there's all sorts of writing on here which talks about his campaign and his victories. And that's about 671, and Thebes was sacked. That was one of the places we mentioned. And that's the more southern Egyptian city. But why would that be important? Because that would be more like the home capital of these Cushite or Nubian kings. So they wouldn't rule way up in the Delta region. They would have their base further south. So he comes and he attacks Thebes. He doesn't necessarily destroy it, but he took a bunch of people, and then there's his son on the rope. And then the inscription is basically saying, I besieged, and he uses this whole long, I besieged, I capture, I took, I demolished. I mean, he kept on just, different phrases. But the royal city of Memphis took royal family captive, appointed kings over Egypt, and he also came in and he dealt with, again, all the major cities, but Thebes and Memphis. So, next one. I just thought this is kind of interesting. They have stuff, this is Ashurbanipal against an Egyptian fort. They don't know exactly which battle. Ashurbanipal is the next Assyrian emperor. Again, it's not that important for the names, but he's the next one. And so this is about 667 to 663. He had several campaigns into Egypt because Esarhaddon had kind of made them submit, and what happens? They don't really want to submit. And as soon as they leave, they try to create problems. And so what happens? The next emperor comes in and has a couple of campaigns in Egypt to maybe get them to think a little better. And so, but this is, if you look at the details of this, you just see, it's very, very interesting to see the kind of thing that's going on. And then they have people, archers shooting, and they've got a shield in front of them, and they got ladders, and they're climbing up the ladder to try to attack the fort. And there's people falling off, and there's people getting shot. And it's just kind of an interesting scene. And you see a lot of these. They've dug up a lot of these in the Assyrian Empire, that they had these scenes. We're going to see that in the time of Hezekiah as well. There's some really interesting scenes that are very powerful. But you see the Assyrians love to carve into stone these battle scenes of their campaigns and their victories. This is, again, the next king, Ashurbanipal, and he's got a whole chronicle. It's in cuneiform, which are those little wedges, and he has a whole history of all of what he's done as a great and powerful king. And so it's basically a boasting. Here's who I am. Here's all the great things I did. Aren't I great? And I want this to be set up forever, so everybody knows how great I am forever. That kind of thing. But and again, what do we know about this? These people came and went, right? When did they die? Thousands of years ago. But at the moment, what are they thinking? Just like everybody, what are they thinking? I'm so important. I'm so great. I am in control of everything, and he's practically forgotten. I mean, there's still people know his name, but it's still in the general. They're forgotten. But God, and people need to see that too. That there's rise and fall of empires. It'll always be that way. As long as there's an earth, there'll be the rise and fall of very powerful people, of nations, of empires, and they come and go, and God is still there. And we shouldn't be afraid of them. We shouldn't be influenced by them. We should trust in God and understand that He's in control. And that's really, I think, a lot of this is. So anyway, this is in the British Museum. They have this Rassam cylinder, and I had a picture to go with it. On it, they have a section of it that'd be like 1.5 columns. And what somebody did is they showed you all the cuneiform, and there's some examples of the wedges, and then underneath they translate it into English for you, so it's kind of nice. So they have this whole thing, and they show you what it looks like, and then they have the translation. So if you want to learn cuneiform, you could like stare at these things for a while, and then you know cuneiform. So anyway, so Esarhaddon subjugated the nation, but Egypt, which is really at this time the Kushite dynasty, they rebelled, and so now the next king, Ashurbanipal, invades and ends Kushite rule. Now, I guess you could say almost Esarhaddon ended their rule, but it wasn't quite over yet, because the last king escaped, and he's still causing a lot of problems. So the two of them combined brought ultimately the subjugation of Egypt. Egypt is still a nation. It's still going to have its times, but it's no longer going to be the power that it used to be. From now on, after this point, then you have the Medo-Persian Empire, and they're going to subjugate Egypt. And then after that, you have the Greeks, and it changes back and forth a little bit, and then the Romans. And so really, there is no independent Egypt in the way that it was before. It becomes more and more oppressed, and so it gets hard to know exactly what point could you say the Egyptian empire ended, because it still continued on. It just wasn't as in control as it was before, and it had to submit to other nations. Let's see. I wanted to get to a map, but let's see. I think I've got it somewhere else. I'm going to back up before I go to another picture. Okay. One other place I want to mention, I didn't mention it before, Kedar, which is northern Arabia. So if you look at, here's Arabia, this big chunk of land, but the northern section up here is Kedar. And the Kedar people were Arab traders, and they were very, very wealthy because they traded over the deserts. So there were people that were traders over the seas, and then now there's the traders in the desert, and they built up a lot of wealth. And so these people actually started influencing Babylonia and this region. And they actually opened up trade routes, which I didn't know this before, but they went in and took over like Edom and other places. And so Edom got pushed into southern Judah, which I do know about that, and they were the Idumeans later on. But they also opened up a port like Gaza. They have a clear route to the Mediterranean, so their trade opened up into that region, and it went all the way into Babylon and beyond. So they were very influential, and so when these empires came, they wouldn't just destroy the Arabs. They would kind of work with them because they were so powerful, and they could get a lot of money from them, and they were very influential. So the Kedarite, the Arabia, is another important group, and that's the thing about these. Sometimes you think, well, I've never heard that group. How important could they be? Well, there's a lot of different nations in the world that have come and gone that were extremely important that we know nothing about. And so the Bible mentions some of these, and sometimes we think, well, what's the point of that? Matter of fact, there's as an example, it's going to be Nehemiah chapter, which I think helps me to understand this passage a little better. I think it's like 5, maybe 6. It's chapter 6. Nehemiah 6, verse 1. Nehemiah 6, verse 1. It came about when it was reported to Sanballat, Tobiah, to Geshem the Arab and to the rest of our enemies that I had rebuilt the wall and no breach remained in it, although at that time I had not set up the doors and the gates, that Sanballat and Geshem sent a message to me saying, come, let us meet together. In other words, we have Geshem the Arab. We actually have two inscriptions, one by him and one by his son, or a goblet that mentions his son of Geshem, the Arabian. They were down here, but they have a very big influence in what's going on here. Because they had trade routes to the sea, what could disrupt their trade? If Judah was coming back and being powerful again, Judah could disrupt their trade. So they've got a very big stake in what's going on with the Jews having returned and starting to get more established. Once they get more established, they can control. Once they control, it cuts away their access to the Mediterranean Sea. So the Arabs are very much concerned with what's been happening with the Jews returning from captivity. But this guy Geshem, there's archaeological evidence of Geshem, and matter of fact, same thing with Sanballat and Tobiah. All of them, there's references in history to those men. So that's kind of interesting. They were very powerful people that were very concerned that the Jews were coming back in and it might disrupt their power structure and their purposes. All right, so this one I just thought was interesting. You have this battle scene, and it's an Assyrian attack of Kedar, which are the Arabs. So they actually went out and had some battles with these Arabs, the northern Arabia. And I highlighted these areas. You see, these people are riding what? A camel. And you got two men. You got the rider, and I guess he's got some sort of weapon. But you get the rider, and then you got behind him what? You get the archer. So it's like a chariot. You get the chariot driver, and you got the guy that's shooting and everything. Well, they're riding camels and doing pretty much the same thing. And then here you have in the scene, you have the same thing. The camel, the two men, and one seems to be focused on riding, and the other one is shooting. Here's his bow and arrow. And then you have these guys on, we'll say horses. I guess there's some variety of horse, or just and they've got a man with an arrow, and they're shooting, but they don't seem to have two men. They only have the one man. But then you see here, this camel has just been taken out, apparently. So they've shot that camel, and he's fallen underneath the rider. And you see, but it's an interesting battle scene. But they have actually a battle of the Assyrians against Kedar, which is the Arabs. They have records of things like that. I have another picture here of just a reminder, because repetition is good. But you have Sea of Galilee, Jordan, Dead Sea. At the Sea of Galilee, near the top, you have this bump along the Mediterranean coast. That's where Mount Carmel is. Because all of this is sand, and then there's mountains up here. That's why you get that bump. But anyway, all along there is the Philistines. This is Israel, with Samaria the capital. Judah, with Jerusalem the capital. The Philistines, did I say Phoenicians here? Well, anyway, Phoenicians, Philistines, Edom, Moab, Ammon, Aram, and then down here would be the Arabs, and then down here is Egypt. Okay? So that's the same map, just different perspective. And I just wanted to leave off with this again, because this is what we're going to be looking at next week, chapters 13 through 23. I say a week, that's what my goal is. To just kind of go through very quickly, look at some highlights of the chapters. If you want to stop and ask questions about certain chapters, that's fine. But we're just going to kind of go through the chapters and just notice that the judgments against all different nations. All right. So anyway, we're going to go through this kind of quickly because I want to get to the parts that are really focused more on God's future plan, the gospel. That's what we're focusing on when we go through Isaiah, because there's too much in Isaiah to do it all in a class that doesn't take a couple of years. So thank you for your attention. We'll continue this next week.